No one at the hospital believed anymore. The protocol had been closed, tests showed no improvement, and the clinical report from the previous week used an expression that usually signals the end: palliative care. For all intents and purposes, it was just another hospital bed waiting for goodbye. But what no one knew was that something invisible had already begun. Something that didn't come from medicine or reports, but from an ancient breath, a forgotten psalm, whispered by a nurse who didn't surrender to statistics. His name was James. And that night, among the machines and the silence, he decided to do something more for Michael, the patient in bed 7, who no longer opened his eyes. If men have given up, he thought, maybe it's time for God to act. And it was there, with his hand on the patient's chest and tears in his eyes, that he began to read, not out of protocol, but out of faith. What happened in the following hours, no one could explain, but everything changed. If you've ever felt the heavens go silent while your pain grew louder, if a diagnosis ever made you feel like the end was an inevitable sentence, then this video is for you. Because there are stories that medicine doesn't record. Stories where the miracle doesn't begin with physical healing, but with a presence. Soon, you'll discover a little-known psalm. A psalm that, according to real testimonies, has touched patients in comas, restored broken homes, and reignited faith where everything seemed lost. But it will only be revealed later on. Before that, you need to hear what really happened in that ICU. Now, become part of this chain. Write in the comments your name, or the name of someone you carry in your heart. Share if you know a story where faith defied the impossible. Let's build together a real network of hope, where each name represents a living prayer, each comment becomes a whisper of a miracle, and each testimony, a bridge between pain and restoration. What James did that night wasn't in the manuals, and perhaps that's exactly why it was so powerful. But what exactly did he read? And why did that psalm, forgotten by so many, trigger something that doctors never imagined? The answer begins right after the next medical visit. Because sometimes, it's when everything seems lost that heaven begins to move. But what James didn't know was that the psalm hadn't been chosen by chance. At the bottom of the drawer where old medical records were stored, there was a small Bible, its cover faded, that belonged to another patient. A man who had passed months earlier, but who, according to the night staff, spent his final nights softly reciting psalms. Before he left, he gave the Bible to whoever might need it when there's no way out. James found the book by accident while organizing papers, and when he opened it, he landed directly on a page marked with a piece of gauze used as a bookmark. There was no bold title. It wasn't one of the well-known psalms, but something in that passage touched something in his spirit. He reread it, swapped shifts with a colleague, and decided that night, when visiting Michael, he wouldn't just do what was required, he'd do what was necessary. Michael was 48 years old, a former civil engineer, a tall man, fair-skinned, his hair darkened by time and treatments. He had entered the hospital due to respiratory complications, which silently progressed to a brutal diagnosis, an aggressive form of lymphoma with lung metastasis. His children visited during the first weeks, but then the visits dwindled. His wife came when she could, and in the final days, not even his closest friends had the strength to face the possibility of the end. His room had become an island, and James, one of the few who still crossed that door with something more than sorrow. He didn't talk much, but every time he arrived, he left a word of faith, soft music playing on a small radio, or just a silent prayer as he changed the IV. That night, however, James felt something different, as if he were being pushed by an urgency that didn't come from logic. He closed the door, pulled up a chair, held Michael's cold hand, and began to read. Each verse sounded like an ancient code, a key trying to reignite a light. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, but I find no rest. He read, his voice steady but choked with emotion. He didn't know if Michael could hear, but he knew that heaven was listening, and that was enough. Then in the middle of the reading, something subtle, almost imperceptible, happened. The monitor's rhythm began to shift slightly. Nothing alarming, no emergency, just a small change. As if the body, dormant for so long, had begun to respond to a melody only the soul could recognize. James paused, gripped Michael's hand a bit tighter, and felt, just for a second, that it squeezed back, not with strength, but with presence. What no one knew was that while James read, something inside Michael had begun to move, not in his cells, but in his soul. A silent meeting between pain and hope. And from that moment on, nothing would be the same. From that night forward, something unexplainable began to happen. James, without knowing exactly why, returned to room 217 every night, even when he wasn't scheduled to work. He'd say it was just to check on the patient, but there was something more, a strange feeling, as if the reading was healing him, too. During the day, his mind was restless. At night, he found peace in that space between pain and miracle. And Michael, although still unmoving, seemed to breathe differently. The nurses would comment, "His vitals are more stable." The doctor, cautious, chalked it up to luck. But James knew that wasn't it. He knew that forgotten psalm was reigniting a light that medicine had already declared extinguished. 3 nights passed like this. James read the same verses, with the same reverence, as if each word were a brick rebuilding something broken, and even without a verbal response, he could feel it. He felt it when Michael's breathing paused at the psalm's most intense parts. He felt it when a discreet tear slid from the corner of a closed eye. He felt that somehow, a conversation was taking place, not from mouth to ear, but from soul to the invisible. And that wasn't just faith, it was conviction. On the 4th night, something changed. When James finished reading, he didn't leave right away. He remained seated, in silence, the Bible open in his lap. That's when Michael, with tremendous effort, moved his lips. He didn't form words, but he murmured. James leaned in, breathless. He placed a hand on Michael's shoulder and whispered, "Do you want me to read it again?" A barely noticeable nod was the answer, and then, as if time had frozen, James began to recite again, but this time, something shifted. Michael cried, the tears flowed freely, silent, but intense. It was as if each verse was washing away what the body could no longer release. James couldn't hold back his own emotions. He knelt beside the bed, closed his eyes, and prayed with more fervor than he ever had before. Not for physical healing, but for presence, for a response, for a sign that heaven was still near. Could it be that the true miracle begins when we stop trying to understand and simply accept that something sacred is unfolding behind the silence? The next morning, the hospital woke up to a piece of news that quietly spread through the halls. Michael had squeezed the nurse's hand during the night. It was subtle, a weak grip, but enough to shatter the sentence that had hovered over him for weeks. Vegetative state. The attending physician ordered new tests. A neurologist was brought in. Technicians entered and exited the room with skeptical looks, trying to find a logical explanation. But James didn't need a report. He knew what had caused it, and for the first time, he chose to reveal to the team what he had been doing during those nights. Most listened with skepticism, but one of the oldest nurses, Ellen, stepped forward and said, "I remember that psalm. My father used to read it to my mother before she passed. I've never seen anything like it. At the time, I thought it was just comfort. But now, I'm starting to think it was more." James showed her the page, discreetly folded inside the Bible. Psalm 71, a psalm rarely mentioned, seldom quoted, in sermons. Yet hidden between its lines lies one of the deepest declarations of someone crying out in weakness. "Be my rock of refuge, for you are my hope, O Lord God." In that phrase, James understood everything. What he was building there was a refuge. With the team's approval, James continued reading at night. Now, he wasn't alone. Sometimes, Other nurses stood at the door. Other times, a relative from another patient would ask to listen as well. Room 217, once clouded by the heavy air of farewell, began to radiate something new: hope. Michael didn't wake up immediately, but his presence became noticeable. He would grow emotional, frown, sometimes even seem to smile during the softer verses of the psalm. And in that moment, the question was no longer whether the miracle was happening, but how many others, in the silence of an ICU, were waiting for someone to bring a psalm as a seed. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to unfold. Patients on Michael's floor started to show subtle signs of improvement. The team began reporting more stories. An elderly woman who had stopped eating now whispered for soup. A young man on a ventilator who didn't respond to stimuli shed tears at the sound of a song playing in another room. There was no scientific proof, but something had changed. And at the center of it all was room 217, where Psalm 71 was read daily, as though someone were watering an invisible root. James was no longer just a nurse. He was seen as someone leading a mission, even if he refused to wear that label himself. One night, as he entered, for another reading, he found something unexpected. The chair beside Michael's bed was already occupied. A young woman held his hand. It was Emma, the youngest daughter. She had traveled from another city after hearing the story. She remained silent for a while, then said, "I didn't know if I should come, but something inside me said there was still time." James stepped closer, read a portion of the psalm, then handed the Bible to Emma. With a trembling voice, she began to read too. Michael responded. A tear fell. James couldn't hold back his emotion. In that moment, he realized the healing wasn't just of the body, it was of absence, of distance, of a longing that hurt as much as the illness. The next day, Emma wrote in a notebook she left by the bedside, "Dad, if you can hear this, know that I'm here. I forgive you. I'll wait for you, and I believe." The note became a prayer, and the prayer, a ritual. Everyone who entered the room would read a verse, write a phrase, touch the Bible with reverence, until the impossible happened. Michael opened his eyes, slowly, blinked a few times, and whispered, "Emma." The young woman's heart raced. The team was called. The room filled up. But in that moment, what mattered most wasn't clinical recovery. It was reconnection. The soul, once asleep, had finally come home. But could Michael's awakening be just a single victory? Or the first of many new beginnings in hearts that, like his, were just waiting for a psalm to help them feel again? In the days following Michael's awakening, Room 217 became known, informally, as the Psalm Room. Nurses talked about it. Patients asked to pass by, even for a few seconds. There was something in that space that went beyond the machines, the beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic, and alcohol. It was as if a gentle presence filled every inch of the room, like an invisible veil of peace hovered in the air. James watched it all with a mix of gratitude and awe. He had never seen himself as a vessel. But in that context, there was no denying it anymore. Something greater was moving through the simplicity of a repeated act, a psalm read in faith. A patient on the edge of death who, against all odds, came back. Michael wasn't fully healed yet. His body remained fragile. But his eyes told a different story. It was as if now he could see through the eyes of the soul. He recognized each person who entered the room with a shy smile and insisted on touching everyone's hands, as if silently giving thanks. Emma began visiting every day. She brought printed copies of the psalm on colorful sheets and left them at the front desk. People from other floors began asking for them too. "Do you have that psalm? The one that woke the man in room 217? They would ask. And what was once just an old passage from a sacred book became printed hope, passed from hand to hand, like a torch reigniting darkened homes. Then, on one of her visits, Emma asked James, "Do you really think it was the psalm that brought my father back?" He paused for a moment before answering, I don't think it was just the psalm. I think it was the sound of his faith echoing through your voice. It was your presence, your forgiveness, and the psalm was the thread that wove it all together. Emma said nothing but smiled with teary eyes, because deep down she knew too, that healing wasn't in the test results. It was between the lines, in the silences filled, in the new beginning that blooms when someone chooses to stay. And what if that lived faith, not just read aloud, could multiply, reach other homes, awaken other sleeping hearts, and prove once more that when science gives up, God begins? The following week, a local news crew showed up at the hospital. Michael's story had reached far beyond the medical center's halls. "Terminal patient awakens after prayer with little-known psalm," read the headline. The journalist who came seemed skeptical at first, but something in her shifted as she stepped into the room. Michael greeted her with a calm smile, still lying in bed, and when she asked if he remembered waking up, he replied, "I remember my daughter's voice, and I remember something touching my heart. It was as if the words were calling me back, not with shouting, but with tenderness." James, beside him, simply nodded. He no longer tried to explain. Now he just bore witness. The story aired that Sunday night. By Monday, the hospital was flooded with phone calls. People wanted to know the psalm, to visit the room, to understand. But what no one expected happened 2 days later. A father, whose son had been in a coma for weeks, came to the reception desk holding a Bible. He didn't ask for medical help. He just requested to sit on the bench outside his son's room and read, and so he did. Every day, sitting, eyes closed, repeating the same words. It was the same psalm, the same one read to Michael, the same one that was now beginning to take root in other stories. Emma realized that this had become bigger than her own pain. She was no longer just a daughter. She was now a bearer of something divine. She began writing letters to other hospitalized patients. Inside each envelope, she placed the psalm and a handwritten note. "Don't give up. The answer may be silent, but heaven is listening." Some letters came back. Others were read and answered. Some got lost in the hallways. But Emma knew, every word released in faith finds its destination. It may take time. It may seem forgotten. But it's never in vain. Meanwhile, James began to feel a different kind of calling. The practical, rational nurse who had always trusted protocols started studying the Psalms more, not as someone seeking miracles, but as someone wanting to understand the invisible pathways of healing. He began writing small excerpts on slips of paper and discreetly left them on bedside tables. He didn't say anything, but patients talked. "There's something here that calms me," they would say, and James smiled. Because deep down, he knew, when science reaches its limit, the invisible begins to work. But could a psalm, forgotten by many and now remembered by broken hearts, truly become a spiritual key capable of unlocking doors that had been closed for years? The impact continued to spread, silently, but powerfully. The medical staff, once skeptical, now treated Michael with a mix of respect and awe. The numbers kept improving. The test results, which once outlined a straight path to the end, now traced a curve of return. "This isn't common," said the new resident. And James, not wanting to sound mystical, replied simply, "It's not common, but it's real." Psalm 30, the one recited on the darkest night, was now becoming the symbol of a turning point. "You turned my mourning into dancing," said the verse. And in that room, where there had only been quiet sorrow, a new language began to bloom, the language of gratitude. Emma, determined to turn the experience into a mission, proposed something unusual, a silent chapel inside the hospital where people could pray, reflect, or simply rest their souls. "It doesn't have to be big," she told the director. "It just needs space for hope." And against all odds, the project was approved. The small room opened 2 weeks later. It had no images, no sermons, just a table with a Bible open to Psalm 30, a few flickering electric candles, and a notebook, where visitors wrote down prayers or thanks. "Thank you for giving me my dad back," wrote a young woman. "Help my daughter heal from her pain," a mother scribbled. Each phrase, an echo of what had happened with Michael. Each word, a seed cast into the invisible soil of faith. James, who hadn't stepped into a church in over 10 years, began visiting the chapel during his breaks. He would sit in silence, say nothing, ask for nothing, just listen. And in that silence, he began to understand. Faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just presence, just the decision to stay, just a whisper in the soul saying, "It's not over yet." On the day Michael was discharged, he walked to the reception desk with slow but steady steps, no longer hooked to machines, no more tubes. He held his daughter's hand tightly, like someone who knew the value of every step. Before leaving, he turned to James and said, "You didn't save me, but you prepared the ground where God planted the healing." James didn't respond. He simply embraced the man who had once been considered a lost case, and who now stood as living proof that heaven still visits the corridors of hospitals. But was the real miracle the physical healing, or the soul's reunion with its origin? That night, the hospital chapel wasn't empty. There was a subtle presence inside, almost imperceptible, like a breeze moving through a sealed room, yet making everything feel new. James entered, once again in silence, but something was different in his eyes. It wasn't the unrest of someone looking for answers. It was the calm of someone who begins to understand that some questions don't need answers for peace to bloom. He walked up to the table, opened the notebook, and wrote a phrase that summed up not only his own journey, but also that of everyone who had passed through that small, improvised altar. "It wasn't what I asked for, but it was exactly what I needed." Next to it, he drew a small cross, not as a religious symbol, but as a reminder of the intersection between pain and hope, between the end and a new beginning. Emma arrived shortly after, carrying flowers and silence. She sat next to James without saying a word. She didn't need to. Michael's story had stitched them together from within, as if they now shared the same invisible language, the same heartbeat. And it was in that shared rhythm that she made a simple but powerful suggestion. "Let's keep this going." James nodded, not like someone accepting a task, but like someone recognizing a calling. He knew not every patient would walk out, like Michael. He knew not every bed would witness such a visible miracle. But he also knew faith doesn't depend on the outcome. It depends on the presence, the willingness to remain when the rest of the world has already left. In the following months, the chapel became a gathering point for those who no longer had words. It became common to see nurses leaving notes, patients shedding tears, and even doctors, once skeptical, pausing for a few minutes to breathe between diagnoses. The Bible remained open to the same psalm. The pages had grown worn from so much touching, but somehow, the more worn they became, the stronger they felt. "You turned my mourning into dancing." It had become almost a mantra, a seed planted in the souls of those who refused to give up. James and Emma began organizing silent gatherings at night. No sermons, no music, just presence. And presence alone began to spark invisible healings. People who carried the weight of old griefs, silent traumas, buried fears, began to find relief. Not in medicine, but in the space of listening, in the spiritual touch of a psalm that, though forgotten by many, now served as the soundtrack for new beginnings. And perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't Michael's. Maybe the real miracle was this: transforming a hospital, a place marked by so much pain, into fertile ground for encounters between heaven and earth. Where what seemed like the end became a new beginning. Where faith, even when silent, found its voice. Where broken hearts discovered they could still beat to the rhythm of a hope that can't be explained, only felt. Because in the end, the psalm didn't just heal one man, it restored an entire chain of faith. A few days later, Michael was discharged. He didn't leave running, didn't celebrate with fireworks. He walked out slowly, with quiet, steady steps, like someone carrying a sacred secret. By his side were Emma, holding his small backpack, and James, eyes glistening with a silent pride. The elevator slowly descended to the ground floor. When the doors opened, the hallway looked different, not because it had changed, but because now it held the memory of what had happened there. The improbable, the unexplainable, the miracle no one dared to predict. As they crossed the hospital doors, Michael took a deep breath. It wasn't just the air outside, it was the air of new life. He felt the sun on his skin, as if for the first time. And maybe it was because he had left behind not just a bed, but a sentence. A death sentence that was overturned not by formulas, but by faith. He turned to James and asked, "Do you think anyone will believe this story?" James smiled and replied, "Maybe not, but whoever hears it will feel it." And that was what mattered. The story wasn't meant to convince. It was meant to awaken. Michael knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. His body was still weak, his mind full of memories that would require care. But something had changed. A strength now came from within, a peace that couldn't be explained, and a mission that now beat like a new heart, to carry that message forward, to tell whoever needed to hear that yes, there is still hope when all seems lost, that yes, there are still hidden psalms, waiting for hearts ready to listen, that yes, God still heals when science no longer knows what to say. And if you've made it this far, maybe this video is also a seed, a reminder that it's not too late, that even in silence, God is still working, that healing doesn't start in the test results. It starts when the spirit is touched by a truth greater than pain. And now, I invite you, write in the comments the name of someone you carry in your heart. It might be you, it might be someone you love. Share your story, your prayer, your pain. Let's build together a living chain of intercession, where every name is like a lit candle, where every word is like a breath of healing, where every comment is like an angel knocking at the door of a miracle. Because even when everything seems lost, there is a psalm, and that psalm might be waiting for you.